Welcome to the Bearded Nerd Podcast. Today, we're diving into the fascinating process of building a fantasy city or sci-fi city from scratch. Whether you're running a TTRPG or you're writing your next novel, crafting a city that feels alive and immersive can bring your world to life. In this episode, I'll walk you through a step-by-step process for creating a city, complete with examples and tips to make it feel dynamic and memorable. With that being said, let's get started. In our first segment here, I would like to discuss the foundation. Why does this city exist? You need to ask yourself, why was the city founded and what purpose does it have? In addition, what does it do to serve the people, or what function does it serve in general? Is it a trade hub? Is it a religious center? Or is it a defensive stronghold? If you're creating any of those three examples, you can then manipulate and craft ideas. For example, the trade hub could be a coastal city founded due to its strategic location on a major shipping route. If it's a religious center, it could be a city built around a sacred site, such as a natural spring believed to have divine properties. If it's a defensive structure or stronghold, it could be a mountain city designed to guard a crucial pass. From there, you are able to craft the founding story aspect of it. Did a legendary figure in your world establish that city? Was it born out of necessity, conquest, or rebellion? A great example that you can use is, let's say, the city of Rheinthal. So the city of Rheinthal was founded when the remnants of an ancient kingdom sought refuge in the cliffs, carving their homes into the stone itself. Rheinthal, I don't know if it's a real city or not, but it just kind of popped into my head while I was crafting some notes for this episode. You can just create something like that. It has a foundation and it has a founding and a reason why it was founded. When you utilize that structure, it's really easy to create cities or landscapes or anything like that that has an actual detailed purpose for your game or your novel. Remember, your players are going to love whatever you create. However, they need the reasons, they need a little bit of the why in your world so that they can immerse themselves further into it. A question that my players have asked me multiple times is regarding the topography, the geography, and whatnot of the city or of the area. And that is the next point that I would like to make. Geography shapes the city. It determines its growth. So a question that you would need to ask yourself is, where is your city located? Does its geography influence its design, its economy, or its culture? For example, river and coastal cities. Cities anywhere near the water thrive on trade, fishing, exploration. They thrive on some sort of energy coming from the trade route that has been established there. Even port cities. For example, if you go to Charleston, South Carolina, it has a different culture that was influenced by the local coastal waters and trade. Now, to contrast that, if your city is in the mountains or in the highlands, it could be a defensive city with mining or a unique architectural structure, such as like cliffside homes. Maybe this is where you want the dwarves in your world to reside, and they have more of the highly defensive cities or the more capable cities to be defended. On a complete opposite scale, you can look at deserts. Those oases or nomadic trading posts with unique water conservation techniques such as the Fremen, those would be cities that you can consider creating, and you can consider those geographies something that influences not only the city structure, but the culture of the NPCs there. And the cool thing about the geography of any city is the unique environmental features that you can create. Those features at times, if not all the time, define the city and make it extremely unique. It makes it stand out. So a great example of this could be like a giant ancient tree in the middle of the city center, a la Whitestone from Critical Role. right? In this case, maybe you create a giant ancient tree that serves as both a temple and a library. I don't know. Maybe it has a glowing crystal embedded in the tree, or maybe there is a glowing crystal embedded in the cliffs next to the city, and it powers all the city's lights. Something of that nature could provide some really unique characteristics for that city. In addition, maybe that unique environmental structure is what brings tourists in from the city, therefore creating a trade, a culture, things of that nature. But it also creates a different type of environment. So maybe the actual physical or geography of the city is what influences the trade, the economy, the culture, everything, and then brings in people, which therefore would bring in your players. Those type of features are really important because it does add flavor to the city. It adds flavor to your world building and further immerses the players in there. It actually not only immerses them, but it gives them a reason to go to that city. You can use those environmental or those unique environmental features as a story hook or a plot hook for your players. Now let's get into the meat and potatoes of it. The structure and layout of the city is going to be important. You want to ask yourself, is this a sprawling city or is it compact? Was it planned or was it uniquely designed to have a logical structure in mind? Or does it feel organic? Here's a couple of examples of what I mean. Is it a sprawling metropolis, right? The trade hub of the region is chaotic with merchants and vendors, so therefore the streets are chaotic. Each neighborhood reflects a different culture, right? Kind of like in New York City, you have different parts of the boroughs that have, heavily populated Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, you have Haitians, you have Little Italy, you have Chinatown, you have all these different parts of the world and all these beautiful cultures in certain sections of the actual city and of the boroughs specifically. So is your city like that? Or is it a grid-based city that's heavily militarized, or it's a heavily planned city built for efficiency? For example, you can look at some place like Tokyo as, actually Tokyo would probably be a great example, or Seoul in Korea, where it's built to be efficient and effective, and it's built to kind of cater to everyone without necessarily catering to everyone. What do I mean by that? It's built for the people in mind and not necessarily one individual. In order to do that, though, you need to divide the city into areas with specific purposes. You should include a market district. These have bustling stalls, exotic goods, maybe even street performers and hawkers that are there to call attention. Maybe there are unique NPCs that you can add for flavor. I would also recommend adding a noble quarter. These are going to be your gilded manors with high walls. It's going to be separated from the common. Then you should have an area in your city where there are docks. So this is going to be a loud and grimy location filled with constant activity from sailors and traders. You can have a lot of good NPCs that are just merchants and traders doing honest work. But you can also have some of the corruption in the city featured here. And speaking of corruption, I highly recommend some sort of undercity. Maybe these are filled with rogues or smugglers or a forgotten society, but an undercity would add a different element, maybe even a unique element to your actual city. The undercity typically has some sort of lawlessness. They don't have to be criminals, but lawlessness is what makes an undercity unique. In the city of Waterdeep, you have Xanathar, who is the crime boss of Waterdeep, of the undercity of Waterdeep, rather. So you can have something like that. If you look into the DC comics as a great example, you have Gotham City, which is, quote, okay and it is a place of, quote, justice, you have a lot of the undercity elements that pretty much rule the city. You have the Penguin, you have all the different crime bosses, the Marcone, I believe it's the Marcones, but you have the entire mob bosses and families that, quote, rule Gotham. That can be a great place of inspiration for an undercity. But I would highly recommend adding some of those examples that I mentioned earlier. That brings a little bit of balance because you have those places where trade and business are conducted. You have a place where NPCs can be tapped into with your noble quarter, and maybe your players go visit them and interact with them. You have the docks where maybe one of your players doesn't really want to go to the nobles. Maybe they want to kind of tap into the local scene and a little bit of the criminal underbelly, which then would lead into the undercity, which would be a great way to explore. So not only do you get to kind of hit every part of the city, if you plan it wisely, you can actually hit most of the pillars of D&D, which is exploration, roleplay, and combat. Because let's be honest, if any of your players are separating from the party and going into the undercity of your city or the underbelly of your city, there may be a combat. Maybe it's a fisticuff style brawl. Maybe it's not anything crazy or serious. Or maybe it's a life or death situation. You don't know. But it's a great opportunity to explore as a game master. Now, having mentioned trade routes and market districts, you want to think about the economy and the resources of your city. What drives the city's wealth? You need to ask yourself, what are its primary sources or industries? How does the city trade with others? Is it an agricultural city? Fertile plains maybe around the city grow abundant crops, and therefore exports maybe wheat or something of that nature. Is it a mining town? Is it a mining city, rather, rich in precious metals or maybe even magical minerals? Or like I mentioned earlier, is it a spot for tourism? Are there festivals? Are there cultural landmarks? Are there geographical landmarks? Are there ties to ancient legends where people go to visit? Is it a site? Is it a religious site that would have perhaps places and markets built up around it to feed pilgrims, to cater to the pilgrims that travel there? What are those connections? What goods flow in and out of the city? What alliances or rivalries exist because of that trade? These are all elements that you can think about when creating the economic part of your world. And from a mechanical perspective, just use whatever mechanics currency that you have. So whether it's gold or credits, use that. Don't need to create something unique unless you want to, but just think of the reason why that city is booming economically or why it's suffering economically. Again, that would be a great story hook for your players to pursue. I would be amiss if I did not mention culture and people, as I was a historiographer specifically, or rather specializing in cultural historiography. So this part I would really want to highlight. What is the culture and the people like? From a population perspective, what species or races or classes or cultures inhabit the city? Is it a melting pot or is it homogenous? What does the city look like? A good example could be, is it a dwarven city where 98% of the city are dwarves because the dwarves run the mines? Or is it a mining city that has mostly dwarves with the humans doing a lot of the trading to the outside cities, and then the elves overseeing the natural protection and defenses of the city? Is it that type of melting pot? Or is it a mountain city or a mining city where the dwarves control pretty much everything, and you being there, if you're not a dwarf, is seen as odd? From there, think about the traditions and festivals of the people and the culture of those people. Highlight any unique events or practices. For example, a citywide festival celebrating the return of migratory birds. Is it a somber event? Is it a crazy fun event, kind of like Mardi Gras? What does it look like? Are there somber annual vigils honoring the founders of the city? Are there unique and crazy parties like Mardi Gras that affect the city? Which, mind you, with Mardi Gras, it was actually a time of feasting before folks went into the period of fasting during Lent. So, do you have a culture that is similar to that, that likes to feast before religious periods of fasting or spiritual periods of fasting? Think of things like that to build up the people and the culture. Because remember, the culture and the people in any world is what gives it color and life. That is what makes it so flavorful. And you, as a GM, are able to get your players immersed in just the snap of your finger. It is so easy. That's such an easy win, as they say. I highly recommend diving deep into this. Now, something that I remember learning in academia is that culture affects everything. So the culture of the people could affect something like the architecture. So how does the city's culture shape its buildings? Are they dome-shaped houses for desert cities? Or are they towering spires in a magical hub? Or perhaps they're wooden homes on stilts in a marshlands. You don't know until you start thinking about its culture. Are they a desert culture, right? Look at the Fremen. The Fremen's a great example where the Fremen are about conserving water and resources. So their homes are built that way. Their homes, everything is built to conserve energy, to conserve fuel, so to speak, water, everything. So think of it like that when you're building it out, which, mind you, you could use Incarnate if that's something that you would like to do. Incarnate has a lot of great features, and I highly recommend it for your map and city building. But before you even do that, you got to write this down. Write everything down. Ask yourself these questions. You may look silly, but it is 100% worth it. So before I go into the story hooks of this podcast, I want to briefly talk about the power and the politics that you can add into this city building. Who runs the city? Is it based upon a monarchy, so therefore they're part of a dukedom? Or is it a council? Is it a guild-driven economy, and therefore the guild masters run the city? So for example, let's say a trade guild that essentially and effectively owns the city with a, quote, mayor being just a figurehead. Is that what you have in your city? Is that what you want to run, right? You got to think about the leadership structure, because then everything else kind of falls into place. So a cool thing that you can do really quick is that you can create some factions with power struggles. That would be the best way to kind of implement this political structure. Create an individual or a council or whatever, but a single thing, and then create maybe 3 factions who would vie for their influence or just influence in general. So, for example, a religious sect, maybe, a thieves guild, and a merchant coalition, each trying to control the city's future, right? And your players could be the revolutionary group that overthrows the corrupt structure or the corrupt nobles that kind of implemented this from the beginning, which leads into my story hook perspective on this episode. From a story hooks perspective, you can find story hooks anywhere. That is what brings your players to the actual city. You can tie it into their current mission or quest, or it could be something that you add during travel. If the party is traveling through the town, you can have it where they spot this city, they rest here, and then they start noticing all the unique features of it. You don't have to say, oh, this is a new city that you never heard of, but you can provide this to the players as information that their characters would know. It's totally understandable that their characters would know this information, and not necessarily the players. You don't have to have the players know this information beforehand. You can just say, hey, this city is a city that you have traveled to in your past. However, the last time you were here was when you were 10 years old. So the city has grown and developed and changed because of XYZ. And then you kind of showcase what happened or what has occurred to make that change. Not only does it bring a unique backstory element that the player didn't know about, but that makes the player feel a little bit more tied into the world. You get to show off your unique city, which then you're able to add an adventure hook. Like I said, maybe the players notice that there's these three factions kind of vying for power and just being a bit abusive of their power over the people of the city. Maybe that gives them enough worry or concern to intercede as adventurers, maybe as the heroes. So that could be an easy hook, but it again adds elements to spark the player interest. Maybe it could be a mysterious illness that when you pass through town is affecting the lower districts of the city. Or maybe there's a rumor of an underground vault that's filled with treasure that the players hear about from two drunk NPCs at the bar or at the tavern. That might spark their interest. A really unique feature could be something where it provides such an interesting story hook that it gives a distinctive personality or quirk, right? So maybe you talk about how the streets are lined with enchanted lanterns that never dim, or a massive central tower that doubles as a university and government center. By implementing those steps and those segments, you can easily create a fantasy city from scratch. Just start with the basics like geography and purpose, and layer in the culture, the economy, and the politics to make your city feel alive. Don't forget to sprinkle in unique details and adventure hooks to give your players a reason to engage with the world. Well, that's it, folks. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your fellow GMs. Don't forget to subscribe for more tips on world building and storytelling. Much love, y'all, and keep gaming.